In an odd coincidence, two of the most powerful men in the Confederacy married relatives of two U.S. presidents. One marriage was tragically cut short, while the other was long-lasting and connected to one of America's most historic sites. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. The first story is of Sarah Knox Taylor, the second daughter of General Zachary Taylor, and the man who would become the first and only president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. Sarah was called Knoxie after her middle name, and the middle name came from the place of her 1814 birth, Fort Knox II in Vincennes, Indiana, where her father was the commanding officer. Being an army brat was more dangerous in the 19th century. When Zachary was serving in Louisiana in 1820, 6-year-old Knoxie and her two younger sisters, 4-year-old Olivia and 1-year-old Margaret, came down with bilious fever, now thought to be malaria. Knoxie survived, but the other two did not. Perhaps because of this near-death experience, or maybe because these frontier posts had limited educational and cultural opportunities, Knoxie ended up spending most of her time growing up with her grandparents near Louisville, Kentucky. At the age of 17, Knoxie rejoined her family at Zachary's latest posting at Wisconsin's Fort Crawford. There she met her father's second-in-command at the fort, a newly commissioned Army lieutenant and the future president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. Knoxie, who was described as charming, clever, vivacious, witty, and the best dancer in the state of Kentucky, fell in love with Jeff, who was 6 years older, despite her father's disapproval. Even though Taylor admired Davis as a soldier, he saw the hardship of his army life on his daughters and wife, and didn't want that continued lifestyle for his daughter. In 1833, Davis was transferred to St. Louis. Over the next 2 years, Jeff and Knoxie kept in contact as their relationship remained strong. They even planned their wedding in their letters. Davis knew he could not support a family on a lieutenant's salary, so he decided to resign his commission. He spoke to his older brother Joe, who owed Jeff due to an issue with an inheritance. So Joe agreed to give Jeff a plantation just outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which he named Briarfield because of all the brush and briars on the property. On June 17, 1835, Knoxie and Jeff married at the home of the bride's aunt in Louisville. Knoxie's parents didn't attend, but the reasons are not clear. Immediately after the wedding, the newlyweds hopped on a riverboat and traveled down the Mississippi River to St. Francisville, Louisiana, and Locust Grove, the plantation owned by Davis's oldest sister, Anna Davis Smith. Mindful of the tragic death of her sisters last time they were in Louisiana, on August 11th, Knoxie wrote to her parents, "Do not make yourself uneasy about me. The country is quite healthy." It was the last message they would receive from her. Both Knoxie and Jeff contracted malaria, with Jeff getting the worst of it. For a time, it seemed Davis would not survive, but as Jeff rallied, Knoxie's condition grew worse. The two were in separate rooms, and as Knoxie became delirious, she started singing. Jeff rousted himself from his bed, entered her room, and held her in his arms as she took her last breath. The date was September 16, 1835, one day shy of their 3-month anniversary. Jeff was so ill the funeral was held in his bedroom. Knoxie was laid to rest in the Davis family plot at Locust Grove, now known as Locust Grove State Historic Site. Over a month later, despite his heartbreak, Davis physically recovered enough to leave Locust Grove. He traveled to New Orleans, then to Cuba, followed by New York City, and then back to Briarfield in Vicksburg. He would work the fields alongside his slaves by day, then spend the nights reading. For the next 8 years, he was secluded in grief. Finally, he was persuaded to enter politics. He lost his first election for state legislature, but showed some promise. Davis was hooked on party politics. Eventually, Davis met Verena Ann Bank Howell and became engaged again. Shortly before their wedding, Davis just happened to run into Zachary and Margaret Taylor aboard a steamship. The Taylors felt that Davis should have known better than to travel to Louisiana during fever season. Davis's sister told Jeff that the Taylors had visited their daughter's gravesite, but Davis and the Taylors had not seen nor communicated with each other over the intervening 10 years. But on that boat trip, they shared their grief and achieved reconciliation. Jeff and Verena married in February 1846, and again Davis headed to Locust Grove for his honeymoon, this time to visit Knox's grave. As Jeff and Verena stood silently together, Verena placed some flowers on Knox's grave. During the Mexican-American War, Colonel Davis served under the command of General Taylor in the 1847 Battle of Buena Vista. Davis fought bravely during the battle despite being shot in the foot. Based on Davis's bravery and their newfound reconciliation, Taylor reputedly said, "My daughter was a better judge of men than I." Jefferson Davis was not the only Confederate leader to marry the descendant of a president. General Robert E. Lee married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington and daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, George Washington's step-grandson and adopted son. Mary was born in Clark County, Virginia in 1807, 8 years after George Washington passed away, when her mother, Mary Lee Fitzhugh, stopped at Anfield while she was traveling. In addition to Robert E. Lee, Mary had many suitors, including Sam Houston. Houston, the namesake of the city of Houston, Texas, served as the first president of the Republic of Texas and is the only person to have been elected as governor of 2 different states, Tennessee and Texas. Eventually, Mary married Robert on June 30th, 1831, at her parents' home, Arlington House. At the time, Lee was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Engineers. Mary had known Robert since their childhood. They were third cousins through their mother's lines. Robert's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was an American Revolutionary War hero and delivered the eulogy at George Washington's funeral, which included the famous line, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen." After their wedding, Mary left Arlington House to move into the officers' quarters at Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. She did not adjust well to the life of an officer's wife. After the birth of their first child, she moved back to Arlington House, which is where she gave birth to her next 6 children, living with them and her parents. When her father died in 1857, Mary was his only living heir, so she inherited Arlington House. Mary and her parents, like many in the Virginia planter class, professed to hate slavery while continuing to benefit from it. They were supporters of the American Colonization Society, which supported the idea of gradual emancipation of enslaved people by teaching them a trade and how to read before paying for their eventual passage to Liberia. Mary did teach her female slaves how to read, but did not support the abolition of slavery or racial equality. She also did not support the South's secession from the Union. In April 1861, Robert saw that war was coming. With the first shots at Fort Sumter days away, Lee resigned from the U.S. Army and took command of Virginia's military forces. He also saw the strategic military value of Arlington House, with its hilltop location overlooking the nation's capital. Concerned for Mary's safety, he wrote to her that she needed to leave. War is inevitable, and there is no telling when it will burst around you. You have to move and make arrangements to go to some point of safety which you must select. The Mount Vernon plate and pictures ought to be secured. Keep quiet while you remain and in your preparations. By the time of the Civil War, 53-year-old Mary's rheumatoid arthritis had progressed to the point that she was confined to a wheelchair. She loved her house and had trouble with her mobility, so she delayed her departure for weeks. Eventually she relented. She ordered the enslaved workers to pack up the family belongings, including the Washington Treasury heirlooms, items from Mount Vernon that had been owned by George Washington. Some items were buried on the property, others locked away in closets, the attic, and the basement. Mary thought she would return in a few weeks. That would not happen. True to Robert's prediction that the government would make Arlington House a target for confiscation, the Union took possession of Arlington House for failure to pay taxes, although the Lees' attempt to pay the taxes were refused. This left Mary and her daughters to live a nomadic existence during the war. After the Civil War, Arlington House was seized by the United States federal government in order to create Arlington National Cemetery. The Lees moved to Lexington, Virginia, where Robert became the president of Washington College, which was later renamed Washington and Lee University. While Robert had given up on ever returning to Arlington, Mary seethed at the loss of her home for the rest of her life. She wrote angry letters to friends, relatives, newspaper editors, and politicians, complaining about the creation of the cemetery and pleading for the return of her home. Although some of the buried items on the property were damaged, others survived. These George Washington heirlooms were declared by Congress as property of the American people and were displayed in the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C. Mary tried to have these returned as well, to which she was also unsuccessful. Mary returned to Arlington House one more time in 1873, a few months before her death and 3 years after her husband passed. Due to her arthritis, she was unable to leave her horse carriage. She was so saddened by what had become of her home, she wrote, "I rode out to my dear old home, but so changed it seemed but a dream of the past. I could not have realized it was Arlington but for the few old oaks they had spared and the trees planted by the General and myself, which are raising their tall branches to the heaven which seems to smile on the desecration around them." In 1882, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling returned Arlington home to the Lee family. After several months of difficult negotiations, Mary and Robert's son Custis sold it back to the federal government for $150,000, or almost $5 million in today's money. Thanks for watching.